with Professor Razeen, who has a joint position at the London School of Economics and at the European Centre for International Political Economy.
Thank you, Julian. Good morning, everybody. Julian asked me to keep my comments extremely brief. I've got three main points to make. The first, a generalization. The second, an example. The third, a warning. The generalization is about the economic benefits of the freedom to trade. Now, the headline figures are that since 1980 to about 2007, the world economy grew in real terms by 150% or thereabouts, and real incomes grew around the world by about 50%. Now, real living standards improved particularly strongly in parts of Asia, in emerging Asia, and especially in East Asia. Now, the parts of the world that have grown most strongly, that have seen the biggest rises in living standards, the biggest declines in poverty, and in human welfare indicators like adult literacy, nutrition intake, and so on, are the countries that have stabilized their economies and liberalized generally. And a critical ingredient of that liberalization has been the liberalization of trade barriers and associated barriers to investment and services around the world. And the fact also is that the strongest liberalization we have seen around the world, which started gradually in the West and then spread to the developing world, the strongest liberalization of these trade barriers has been in East Asia, which has also seen the strongest increases in living standards and conditions of human welfare broadly defined. The headline numbers from China are very clear. We've seen about 400 million people raised out of absolute poverty, a middle class that is now anywhere between 150 million and 300 million strong. And a critical ingredient in enabling that to happen has been China's historic opening to the world economy, especially since the early 1990s, which is the biggest instance of liberalization the world has ever seen. And despite this severe global recession we're seeing now, by the end of this decade, we will still probably see and have seen the biggest rise in global living standards, especially for the poor in the emerging, developing world the world has ever seen. And trade liberalization and investment liberalization has been, as I said, a very important part of that. So much for the broad generalization with which many of you are familiar. Let me give you one example. I'm half Sri Lankan. I grew up in Sri Lanka. I've just come back from a couple of months in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, as you know, has been beset by political conflict and violence, also by bad government and governance for over a generation now. In fact, it goes back longer than that. But the economy was opened up, the first to be opened up in South Asia, from about 1977. Not enough, but to a significant extent. The key result of that opening up of the Sri Lankan economy is the emergence of a garments industry, which despite everything, despite instability and conflict and bad government, has withstood Chinese and other competition, in particular niche areas. And the signs are visible. Wherever you go in Sri Lanka, from the free trade zone to pockets of the countryside, there are garments factories everywhere. And what these garments factories do is provide employment mainly to young women from the countryside, from very poor families in poor villages. And the garments industry has become the mainstay of the rural economy in Sri Lanka, because without it, it would collapse. We're talking of 50% of Sri Lankan exports and about 1 million people employed, broadly speaking, in a country with a population of about 20 million. That's the example I'd like you to bear in mind. Let me finish with a warning. Tom is quite right. We now have an emerging wave of protectionism after the historic liberalization we've seen around the world for the past 2 or 3 decades. It has certainly picked up pace in the last 6 months in the wake of this global economic crisis. It has been exacerbated by measures governments have undertaken, starting with the United States and spreading around the world to increase government intervention at home, often under the cover of fiscal stimulus packages. And this has spilled over into rather subtle forms of protectionism abroad, which invite tit-for-tat retaliation by the Chinese and others. Now, it's so far not as dramatic or as cataclysmic as what we saw in the 1930s, but it looks like a replay of what we saw in the 1970s. We're seeing subtle, mainly non-tariff barriers applied around the world. It took 15 years or more to get rid of these barriers then. They did great damage to the world economy then. They deepened and prolonged recession then. The risk, the danger is that these measures, uncontained, big government at home, spilling over into protectionism abroad, will delay and prolong the kind of recession we're seeing now and compromise chances and hopes for healthy recovery. So the short-term challenge is to contain the kind of protectionism we're seeing coming from both developed and developing countries. The more medium-term challenge, once the recovery is underway, is to get back on track with the unfinished business of further liberalization and globalization for all-round mutual benefit. Thank you.